We have in the studio Marty Clapp and James Umber. How y'all doing? Welcome to the program. It is good to have y'all.
I'm happy to be here. Good to be here.
Yes, indeed. All right. So I'm glad everyone can hear us too as well. And we're going to get started. Firstly, let's introduce ourselves real quick. Marty, let the people know who you are.
My name is Marty Clapp, and currently working with the youth at Compass Church in Chandler and do prison ministry on Friday nights. And so being very busy with those things, I really enjoy it.
All right. Awesome. And you, how long have you been involved with apologetics now?
Somewhere between 25 and 30 years.
And how did you get, one of the main areas you specialize in is things relating to Genesis and science and creation
especially
apologetics.
the sciences, yeah. Love these areas of science. We'll be covering some of these today.
Yes, we will. Yes, we will. Well, James Umber, who are you?
Oh, yeah. So, like you said, my name is James Umber. So I'm the chapter director for the Ratio Christi chapter at the ASU campus, the main campus there in Tempe. And, so what we do is we invite Christian students, but also atheists, skeptics, Muslim, Hindu. We all come together, have thoughtful, respectful dialogue about the big questions in life. So that's what I do 5 days, 6 days a week.
Yeah, he's out there tabling at Arizona State and talking to people and all kinds of events. It's pretty awesome. So you're regularly engaging and regularly talking to people, so you kind of got a very right there, boots on the ground view of what people are saying.
Yep.
And these guys work a lot together, and I've had them at Doctor for the Block, so maybe you've seen them from there. And they go all the way back to the days we were doing the radio show on 20th 4th Street in Camelback.
Yeah.
How'd you get into the science side of things, James? What about you? How'd you get into that aspect?
Well, I've always been fascinated by science, and I've been fascinated by the big questions in life. And you can't deal with the big questions in life without dealing with origins issues. And so automatically you just immediately get into science. And once you start trying to investigate those issues, trying to be as objective as possible, you start, before you know it, you're starting to get into cosmology, physics, you're starting to get into biology. And, I'm a firm believer that if you just study the terminology, try your best to try to understand the terminology of a field, and really it takes a lot of work, but so many people out there have done so much more than I have. So I figure I can get in there and start to understand the terms, start to understand the technical aspects, and start to try to understand these fields. And so I'm trying to live the examined life and trying to understand these big questions.
Right, and I appreciate that is what these guys do. I've known them. And we're going to be responding, hopefully with knowledge, information, truth, love, and graciousness here today to a chapter from a book. This is part of an ongoing series. A number of apologists have all reviewed elements of the book, and the book under question is There Be Gaslight by Brady Goodwin Jr., a.k.a. Phanatik, 30 years in various forms of ministry, and specifically, most people know him from his days as the lyrical MC with the Cross movement out of Philly. And so we open up this book subtitled Does the Bible Tell the Truth About Our Creation, Fall, and Redemption? Focusing on the creation part today. And we've done chapter 3 with Dr. Michael Brown. We've done chapter 2 with Alex McElroy. That's on his channel. There's a playlist for all these reviews. And today is chapter 3 of the book, which deals with elements...
4?
Did I say chapter 4? Oops, sorry. Excuse me. Yeah, I already said. Thank you. I appreciate that. See, that's why I'm glad you're here, man. You've earned your keep, man. Chapter 4, which is just a theory. Sent right there, and we are going to look into this and respond, and I'm looking forward to it. We got our notes up, we got everything we need. That begins with a quote from Augustine. We should take all means to prevent such an embarrassing situation in which people show up vast ignorance in a Christian and laugh it to scorn. Augustine 3:60. And then he gives an example from his own life where a student asks him about evolution, and he says, well, yeah, but it's just a theory. And he says now, he's embarrassed by the answer that he gave. And so we're going to talk about that idea of evolution, just a theory. If you're going to start this conversation off, James, how would you start it off as we get into this?
Yeah, I think it's important to start with common ground, and I would agree with you that I would agree with Mr. Goodwin that so many Christians in the pews average Christians. I've heard say, "Oh, evolution's just a theory." And I got to say, I stopped them at that point. I teach a class at my church, and one of the main reasons I teach that class is to help Christians think more carefully through these issues. And so as I tell people when they say, "Oh, evolution's just a theory," I say, well, we can't be so quick to dismiss something just because it's called a theory. Oftentimes scientists mean something very specific by that. And so I agree with him that we can't just merely dismiss a scientific concept by calling it a theory. So I'm with him on that.
Good opening words, Marty.
Yeah, I think I want to begin by pointing out that any comments, at least that I'll make today, some of the observations that I'll make today, I just want to be clear for those watching or listening. Just want to be clear that my comments are not so much a critique of this gentleman, not so much a critique of his book per se, because I haven't had a chance to read the entire book. So most of my comments today are regarding chapter 4. And I'll even go so far as to say I'm not even really necessarily critiquing what he has in chapter 4, because he may or may not address these. He may unpack these in other chapters that I'm not aware of. So that might leave these people watching going, well, then why are you here? And why are you? Well, because after having read chapter 4, I love the topics that Mr. Goodwin raises in this chapter. And these are topics that we hear a lot about. And so what I'm doing today is not so much about him or his book, but the topics in general, because they're common, they're important. He may, whether he does or doesn't expand on these in his book, I think that the comments that all of us will be sharing today will be helpful. So hopefully it will open dialogue, open discussion, and then they can compare notes.
Yes, so raising awareness about the topic in general.
Yes.
And more, not just, critiquing per se, although where it's warranted, yes. Also just kind of interacting and responding to the information presented. So we've got our notes. Now, I'm looking at this. What is the best place to start? I feel like it might be the first thing right there, Marty, is faith, and we have to talk about how we would define that. Is it in conflict with science? Is faith in conflict with science? How would you respond to that?
Well, that's what really got my interest in this topic in this chapter, because this comes up a lot. And I think that oftentimes we hear in our culture, we'll hear people say things like, well, I don't believe in God because I believe in science. I've heard people say that science is...
Nacho Libre. Yeah. Have you ever seen Nacho Libre?
No.
Yeah. No?
No.
So it's funny because he's a Catholic, like a monk, right? And like a kind of a priest kind of guy. And he has a secret desire to wrestle. He's down there in a rural area of Mexico. And he comes across a guy who's like a street urchin, like literally stealing bags of chips from the alleyway, right? And he's like, I'm worried about your salvation and stuff because you have not been baptized.
Oh, my.
And that's the Catholic guy, he wants to make sure he's saved before they wrestle, right? So God's on their side. And the guy who's like, maybe he may need to see a dentist and a hairdresser, and he might need some more nutrients as well. He says, I don't believe in God, I believe in science.
Yeah. Well, there you go.
So that's literally what he says. It's like, humor, the element of surprise, because you're surprised that guy just said that, right? But go ahead, right? I don't believe in God, I believe in science.
Yeah, we hear that a lot, and this is why, as a result, I think that that's why so many in our culture, because that they really do hold that view. I think that they honestly think that faith and science are two very distinct, separate categories. And this is why you hear them say things, or you hear phrases like faith versus science, fact versus faith, science versus belief, and that sort of thing. So that really is the view. So let's kind of unpack that for a moment. I want to start with the topic of faith. I think that most of us, when we hear the word faith, I think it's pretty safe to say that generally we think of the religious person, the Christian, the pastor, those within the religious community. It's typically what we think of. I think it's pretty safe to say we typically do not, when we hear the word faith, we typically do not think of the professor or the intellectuals, the skeptic, the scientist, that sort of thing. But as it turns out, and this might surprise a lot of people, there are actually several things that the atheist, the unbeliever, takes by faith in order to hold their position. And the reason I say that is because many of the things that they believe are things that are back there in the past that we don't have access to, that they don't have access to, and so they really do have to take certain things on faith. For example, one of the things that they take by faith is by faith they believe that the universe either came from nothing or came from some form of matter or mass energy or a quantum vacuum that was always there before the beginning of the universe. That's an article of faith. I think secondly, they take by faith, they believe that order came out of disorder. That is, that all of the complex, intricate, orderly systems that we see all around us somehow over time eventually came out of the chaos and disorder of what they would term the Big Bang. They believe that life came from non-living matter. That is, they believe by faith that life on Earth began somewhere back there in the past when non-living matter, chemicals, somehow organized itself into the very first living cell. But even on that point right there, we've got to take seriously other scientists like James Tour, who is a synthetic organic chemist, and he and other scientists say there is no way. Given what we now know, there's simply no way that idea can stand. So they believe that. And then I think another thing that comes to mind is I think that by faith, they believe that abstract and non-physical things. And by that, I'm referring to things like mind, consciousness, the laws of logic, information, mathematics, ethics. They are taking these things by faith. So the point is, in all fairness, there are many things that our skeptic atheist friends do take by faith in order to hold the views that they hold. And this brings us to the topic of science. James, did you want to say something?
If it's all right, I was just going to throw out that it's interesting. Dr. Paul Davies, who's an agnostic, doesn't believe in God. He's a physicist. He teaches here at ASU. Even he said, even the most atheistic scientists accept as an act of faith the existence of a law-like order in nature that is at least in part comprehensible to us. And he goes on to say, so science can proceed only if the scientist adopts an essentially theological worldview.
Every time I hear Paul Davies quote, I have to bring up an irrelevant vignette real quick here. And I'll let you guys think about what we're going to talk about next on our list here. While I do this, which is I went to see Daniel Dennett, who has somewhat of a resemblance to Darwin, as many people have noted. And it was at Arizona State University. And afterwards, the nerds are kind of lobbying around, trying to get an autograph of their book or whatever and talk about sky hooks and cranes and that kind of thing or whatever, right? Sky cranes, rather. Sky hooks, that's a basketball shot. Anyway, so whatever it is, they're talking and I say, Omar, hey, that's Dr. Davies over there. So he's like lingering around the lobby, and he's like not occupied, it appears. It's like, I want to go talk to him. So I was like excited to I'd just been going through, I think, the Mind of God book or one of those, and I was excited to talk to him, and I had these quotes in my head. And I've done this before where I meet someone and it goes blank and I entirely biff it. So I'm like, oh, Dr. Davies, I said something like, could you elaborate, or I love that quote of yours. And then I proceeded to quote him something that I had memorized, but it was Robert Jastrow.
Oh, no.
I was quoting from God and the Astronomers.
Oh, no.
And I was like, yeah, I was like, so I just love that. He's like, and he looks at me befuddled and goes, I said no such thing.
That's great.
And I said, what? But I just read it. And I don't know why in my mind, what was going on, but I quoted to Davies Jastrow saying, I love this quote of yours. And I said no such thing. So anyways, there's my Paul Davies story. But go ahead.
Well, so that's faith. So, at least at the moment we're talking about this idea of faith versus science. So as I just pointed out, there are things that the skeptic does take by faith. And this brings us to the topic of science. And I think that just quickly to say that when we're talking about the science, we can't overlook the fact that some of the founding fathers of science were creationists. And we're talking about people like Kepler, Boyle, Faraday, Isaac Newton, Louis Pasteur. You've got the Swiss mathematician Leonard Euler and others. And these were people that we simply cannot ignore because they did a lot of the heavy lifting to even get the sciences off the ground. And we owe a lot of the sciences to their pioneering work.
Yeah, a lot of the major, what we would call branches.
Yes.
Branches.
Yeah,
Not every single one. And we're not saying we would have this exact same theology. Even Newton, who I don't believe was a Trinitarian, had said that he wrote more on theology than he did science. And there's something to be said for that. that, and it shows, okay, there's not a conflict. In fact, we're not operating on the presupposition that God has made an ordered world. But did you want to say something on that? Because I know that's not a main thing. We just want to bring out, guys, the idea that when we say faith, we're not talking about every religion in the world. He's talking about Christianity, I think, especially. That's what we're talking about, because we're not denying reality like certain religions do. We're talking about a God who's made an ordered world. We're saying believing in that God is not at all in conflict with science. In fact, it matches up with the presuppositions needed to do science, and that's where we might want to talk about, unless you got something to say, what is science anyway?
Well, and I think a couple things that are foundational to science, if you think about it, in order to do science, first of all, you have to operate within the laws of logic. And those laws that govern reasoning and rationality, those laws are not of a material nature. They are immaterial. They don't change over time. They are universally true. And then secondly, in order to do science, you got to have a universe that behaves in a predictable manner. And this gets back to what Vocab just said. And the only way you can make scientific predictions is if you have a universe that behaves in a very predictable manner in order to make those scientific predictions.
Right. You need what sometimes is referred to as the uniformity of nature.
Yes.
The uniformity of nature. You need general reliability of your five senses. General reliability of five senses. Some notion that what goes on inside here can map or match what goes on out there. All kinds of things like that. So yeah, do you agree as far as what is science in the first place type of thing,
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of the presuppositions, the things that you have to assume just to get started in science, make sense in a Christian worldview. It's interesting, Dr. Steve Fuller, who's an atheist, and he's a philosopher of science, he just recently wrote in 2017, he had said that, quote, a distillation of research in the history and philosophy of science suggests two biblical ideas as having been crucial to the rise of science, both of which can be attributed to the reading of Genesis provided by Augustine. And he goes on to explain who Augustine was, but then he says the two concepts that are there in Genesis that are crucial for science is, number one, the image of God, and number two, original sin. And you might think, well, what does that have to do with science? Well, the image of God is important for science because we can actually trust our ability to know. If we think of ourselves as designed with an apparatus for knowing reality, that in fact, the ability made in the image of God, the ability to know the deep things of the universe, not just that which is necessary for survival, but to actually grasp deep concepts of the universe and the structure of the universe, that makes sense if we're made in the image of God. In a sense, made to be similar to God. Also, original sin. What in the world would that have to do with science? Well, remember, science is all about testing. It's all about trying to come up with an objective way of knowing apart from our fallibility. Well, original sin is all about our fallibility. And so that's why it's important to be able to test what others say. You have to have some sort of method to be able to do that. The fact of the matter is we found that in science, and any of us can be guilty of this, in science we can tend to be biased toward our theories, our own ideas, and we can tend to want to just defend that one theory to the exclusion of all other evidence that comes along. But if you're providing footnotes, if you're testing, if you have a method for testing these ideas, then you can actually start to overcome a little bit your own bias. So, yeah.
We are responding to Chapter 4 of Let There Be Gaslight by Brady Goodwin Jr. This is part of an ongoing series on this channel and other channels. And today we've got Marty Clapp and James Umber, two of my buddies here from Phoenix who specialize in this area, to talk about this idea of just a theory. And here on page 70 of the book, here's what he says. And I think this will lead us to points 6 and also a little Galileo talk here as I read this. And here's what it goes on page 70 to page 71. It is often argued that theism, and particularly Christian theism, laid the groundwork for modern science. Sounds like you. The Bible depicts the world as ordained and providentially sustained by God, and therefore, nature is ordered and reliable. I think we just said that. These traits ensure that key features of reality can be consistently observed, verified, and explained. So far, he sounds like an apologist. Yet, most who deal with this subject also feel compelled to mention Copernicus or Galileo as example of the Christian church's historical closed-mindedness when scientific discovery challenges the claims of Scripture. Before you answer, here we have a paragraph. And in the beginning, he says, okay, say Christians say this, and the Bible portrays God this way. He doesn't contradict, he doesn't criticize, he doesn't interact with that at all. He jumps to, but what about the church doing this stuff over here?
Right.
That seems like a red herring. That seems like changing the subject. That seems like the, well, what about this type of fallacy? You guys see that? He doesn't interact and say, no, actually it's a god of chaos, or that's not needed, or anything like that, or we could get that from some other natural. And he doesn't do any of that. He says, but we need to bring up Copernicus and Galileo. Right. But since he went there, we've been known to hunt rabbits, so follow him down the rabbit trail. What about the Middle Ages? No new knowledge because of the church. What about Galileo being punished for his science? Right. What's up with that, man?
Yeah. I think first of all, compliment to props to Mr. Goodwin for he's familiar with these arguments. He's familiar with the example, the point that many have made that science owes its modern science owes its origins to Christianity and these theistic views. But yeah, then changing the subject onto an example where it looks like maybe Christianity and science were in conflict here. Right. I partially agree with Mr. Goodwin. Let me put it that way. I want to be as charitable as possible. I partially agree in that I think the Inquisition was horrific. It was horrible. This was part of the Inquisition, and I come from a Protestant perspective. And us Protestants we're not doing so well during the Inquisition. The Catholic Church, as an institution, targeted Protestants and others. So certainly I'm not going to be in favor of the Inquisition, and I think it was horribly unbiblical.
And we're not fans of, all due respect to our Roman Catholic friends, we're not fans of the Pope.
Yeah.
We're not fans of the Vatican. I'm putting it in a layman's way, but these are not things that we think. We like the Reformation.
You're right. Yeah, exactly.
So I just want to bring that out to everybody.
So when he says Galileo, Copernicus, these are examples of the Christian churches. Well, that would be at the time, the dominant church would be the Catholic Church. Not saying that that's the same. Accurate of the Catholic Church during all times, but certainly at that time, their historical closed-mindedness. Well, in a sense, I agree. There was a closed-mindedness going on. Look at how they treated certain Protestant reformers. But he says, when scientific discoveries challenge the claims of Scripture. Now, it gives the impression that this is primarily about a scientific discovery challenging the claims of Scripture. And in fact, he goes on to say, quote, Galileo began promoting the idea that the earth was in motion, goes on to say, for this view, the view that Galileo was promoting, that the idea that the earth was in motion, for this view, which contradicted the teaching of the Bible, he says, he was tried and condemned by the Inquisition of the Roman Catholic Church. So it says that's the reason why he was tried and condemned. That's the part that I'm going to have to disagree with. I don't think we see that historically. We have Galileo's trial proceedings. They were discovered in about 1775, and the historian Dr. Timothy Moy does a great job analyzing this in his chapter called "The Galileo Affair in Science and Religion: Are They Compatible?" And in that he says this. He says, quote, while scholars have been unable to come to a consensus on why Galileo was tried by the Inquisition, okay, so there's not a consensus on that, almost all historians agree that it was not primarily because Galileo believed in Copernican heliocentrism. So the primary reason that he was tried and condemned was not because of his scientific view. So if it wasn't for that, though, why condemn him? What was the problem? Well, I think the primary reason that I think a lot of historians agree upon, and even if you don't agree that this is the primary reason, this would be among the top couple of reasons. It's because he was questioning Rome's authority right after the Reformation. Right after this Protestant Reformation, he's questioning Rome's authority, and they were very, to put it lightly, they're very sensitive to that at that time. And when I say he was questioning Rome's authority, someone might say, well, that's what we're talking about. He was questioning their authority when it comes to science. That's not what I mean. I'm talking about he questioned their authority overall, their authority as any sort of church authority. And I get this because he mocked the Pope. Now, we're talking about right after the Inquisition, or right after the Reformation.
This isn't like now where, you could make a political cartoon of the Pope or whatever.
Right.
This is at a different time.
Yeah.
He's mocking the Pope.
The Inquisition is happening. I mean, people are being burned, people are being killed, and yet he's mocking the Pope. In fact, Moy goes on to say, this historian, he goes on to say, quote, Galileo had put the Pope's words from one of their private conversations into the mouth of Simplicio, otherwise known as the Simpleton.
Yeah, the character of the fool
Yeah.
is clearly basically the Pope.
Is the dunce, the idiot, in other words. So he takes the words of the Pope from one of their private conversations and puts it in the mouth of the idiot in this story. I mean, he was, now many historians have pointed out he was not respectful in the way he confronted these issues. He was brilliant. Galileo was obviously brilliant, but sometimes, those who are brilliant are not good at the sort of social aspect and being respectful. And I think, so that's a primary issue. I think that was a major part of why he was targeted. But also, secondly, even if we do focus on the science, I don't think it was primarily about a disagreement about the conclusions, but more about methodology. How well was this theory proven? And in fact, Moy goes on to say, with his erroneous proof of Copernicanism, Galileo apparently hoped to climb the pyramid to the most prestigious court of all, the Vatican itself. He wanted to become the official mathematician and astronomer for the Pope. He took a gamble on his proof, lost, and suffered the consequences. He goes on to explain that basically he had very poor proof of heliocentrism. So he didn't have a good argument that stood the test of scrutiny at the time. He was right, ultimately, and certainly the Vatican should have paid more attention, but he did not have really solid proof.
Yeah, and a lot of the people who were really going against him was the scientific establishment, if you want to look at it that way at the time.
Right.
John Lee asked an interesting question in regards to this, because understand, everyone, the book that we're interacting with is written by someone who used to be involved with Christian apologetics, went to seminary and all that. And John asked, why did Phanatik turn from his whole belief instead of just becoming a theistic evolutionist or something? Well, he does lay out the reasons for that in the book, John. And what he does is he says that all the answers that Christian scholars and apologists and academics and interpreters and preachers and pastors, etc., give are insufficient. So any way you turn, you're messing with stuff that either is insufficient or creates so many problems in other areas that it becomes unsolvable. And so part of what he does in the book is say, here's the problem, here's the Christian answers, and basically says, and I don't buy any of them. So in a way, the book is basically could be subtitled, I don't believe in evolution, therefore Christianity's false. That's kind of the essence of the book. Now, we're only looking at one chapter today, and we're interacting with some things that he either brings up directly or implies, such as, is it true, guys, that the Bible claims that the sun revolves around the earth? We talk about Galileo, we need to talk about that. Does the Bible claim the sun revolves around the earth?
Right. Yeah. This claim is made mainly on page 70, page 71. We see this claim made in Mr. Goodwin's book. He says the idea that the earth was in motion, rotating and revolving around the sun contradicted the teaching of the Bible. He certainly points out that Martin Luther certainly thought that. Martin Luther, the reformer, thought that the sun revolved around the earth and that Scripture defended that. In fact, Mr. Goodwin goes to some of the verses that Martin Luther did as well. He says, our modern Bibles still say that the sun miraculously stood still and that it rises and sets, pointing to Joshua 10:12 and Psalm 113:3. If these words are to be taken literally, he says, then the Bible is incorrect.
And also, notice, though, even on page 71, he quotes Luther here from... it's interesting because this is not a primary source, so it'd be interesting to track this down. Andrew Dixon White's book. History of the Warfare of Science with Theology and Christendom. That's one of the books, I believe, that started the whole science versus Christianity kind of thesis.
The conflict thesis,
Yeah, that's where the Martin Luther quote comes from, interestingly enough. But interesting, here's what Brady says. He says, well, Luther's reason for rejecting Copernicus' scientific findings was clear. And then he focuses on the part where Luther says, sacred scripture tells us that Joshua commanded the sun to stand still, not the earth. I'm going to get into that. But notice what Luther, in this quote, ostensibly, said right before that. This fool wishes to reverse the entire science of astronomy. So what else is, what's the first part of what Luther is saying? This fool wishes to reverse the entire science of astronomy.
So he's putting his, he's certainly viewing science as a way to know.
According to this quote, Luther is saying, well, part of the problem with that is like the whole science of astronomy would have to be flipped around a switch.
Right.
And indeed, it is called the Copernican revolution within scientific thought. But Brady wants you may think, well, Luther, if he said this, it's just, in my understanding, that any of these kind of quotes for Luther are from his table talks. That's when he's sitting around at the table, not in some speech or something. That's my understanding with quotes like this. But he focuses on the scripture part, but he also says the science of astronomy. But what about Joshua's long day and all that? Because this comes into play here.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I think the long day would probably be the main thing that he would point to. The sunrise and sunset we could deal with, but I think mainly the main concern is this long day. So Joshua 10:13, it says that God caused the sun to quote stand still. And this sounds like, okay, the sun was moving beforehand and around the earth, and then God caused the sun to stand still. But I think what this is something similar to what Mr. Goodwin himself describes at one point. He describes what he calls phenomenological language, and I think many theologians have pointed to that. He says that when presented... he says outdated biblical ideas involving nature. Christians often explain these passages by saying that the author uses, quote, phenomenological language, which is to say they wrote about things the way it appeared to them, appeared to ancient, unaided human eye. And then he goes on to point, even we today, even though we know that the Earth is rotating and revolving around the sun, even today we say, hey, we're going to go watch the sunset, that sort of thing. I think we have something similar going on here with the sun standing still. And I don't think it can be dismissed too easily because it's not just common everyday language. I think it's, rather than phenomenological language, I tend to like to use the term observational language. From our point of view as the observer, the easiest way to describe what we're seeing is the sun revolving around the earth, or the sun moving at least, not even revolving. We're not even making a claim about the relative movement of the earth and the sun. Usually when in a basic conversation, an everyday conversation, we're not intending to get into those details. We're just talking about the movement of the sun relative to us. And so it's interesting to see that even scientists do this. Even scientists in science textbooks do this. So I noticed in the astronomy textbook, Understanding Astronomy by Dr. Schroeder, who works at Weber State University, this college-level textbook, it even says the sun's motion through our sky caused day and night. Interesting. The sun moves through our sky. The sun moves through our sky. He goes on to say the sun takes a full 24 hours to make a complete circle around the earth. The sun takes, this is an astronomer. He's a PhD astronomer. He's saying the sun takes 24 hours to make a complete circle around the earth. Now, is he actually is it that this PhD scientist is making some crazy claims, geocentric claims in a textbook? No, of course not. What he's doing in this chapter is he's describing sunrise, sunset, these cycles that we see. And in that context, he's not trying to describe a whole system of the Earth's relationship to the sun, relative movement and all that. He's just trying to make the point that that these are the patterns that we see. And so because of that, the quickest way to describe it, think about what you'd have to do if you wanted to describe it otherwise. You'd have to say something like the rotation of the Earth causes the appearance of the sun to rise and it would become so cumbersome because in a context where you're not even intending to describe those scientific details. He goes on to say, we define our day based on the motion of the sun, and goes on to even further say the sun's path across the sky varies with the seasons. And it's not just like, okay, you found one textbook that says this. No, go to the Griffith Observatory website. There's an article there by Dr. Alter. He says, quote, he describes the, quote, general course of the sun across the sky. The fact of the matter is these are just two quick examples, but we see this all the time, that scientists, when they're not intending to describe the whole system, will use observational language.
Don't let all those geocentrists on the internet get a hold of those quotes, because they'll say, see, they know the truth.
Yeah.
I'm gonna come to you in a second here, Marty. Black Protestant asks the question, vocab are you going to do to debate? I am not sure what debate you're talking about. Could you please clarify? If you're saying would I debate Brady or Phanatik, the answer is yes, I would. And so would Dr. Michael Brown if he's interested in that. If he doesn't want to do that, we could talk, but I'm not sure what you're talking about. So in response to that, he talks about that thing that Christians would say in page 72, kind of what you just said, and then he says, hear this. He says, and so when Joshua prayed for the sun to stand still, perhaps he was simply praying phenomenologically, and it was recorded and reported to us in the same figurative manner. But think about what that means. If God would have answered Joshua's literal prayer, there would have been no miracle to speak of, because the sun was already standing still. So then God must have interpreted what Joshua was really asking for, but could not have known to pray, i.e., that the earth would stand still. And if that is what God did, then whoa! It was not the sun that paused in mid-orbit, but the earth on its axis. Isn't that an even bigger miracle than we, Joshua or Israel, initially thought? And so there, we're kind of just going up against the idea of miracle in the first place, because he's like, okay, well, if that's what's up, then it's a miracle. Let's talk about miracles here for a second, Marty. The nature of miracles, the possibility of miracles, and also are miracles science stoppers? Because I think, that's a territory he goes into with. But think about what this would have taken, right?
Well, if I can, I think I would like to separate the two things of miracles and the idea of God as a science stopper, what we sometimes hear as God of the gaps. The reason I want to separate them is because, at least in my mind, I typically, when we hear terms like God of the gaps or God as a science stopper, generally, they're not so much using those to explain extraordinary or miraculous events as much as they're used to explain, or were being used to explain, natural phenomena that they didn't quite understand at that time. So let me put that on hold for a moment and come to the thing of miracles. So just a comment. When it comes to the topic of miracles, I think that it just follows that if God really exists, and there is very, very good evidence in the areas of science and philosophy that this God really exists. So if that is the case, and if the evidence, and there's a lot of evidence that shows that God is the first cause of the universe. So given that, it logically follows that if this God really exists, and he has the authority and the power to bring into existence the universe and everything in it, then it logically follows, if that's the case, then what we see, what we consider miracles are really, they're not a problem. I think that something else we need to take into consideration in the case of miracles, there's a great 2-volume set. I think it's about 1,200 pages between the 2 volumes. Dr. Craig Keener book, Miracles. There's a subtitle, The Credibility of the New Testament Accounts. And then regarding miracles, I think a third thing that I think we got to take seriously are NDEs, or near-death experiences, because some of them are veridical experiences. So I don't think that any of these things, that first point about God existing, and I think that's the first domino from which everything logically follows, and then we got to take these other things into consideration. But to kind of transition from the topic of miracles to what you had mentioned earlier is this sort of the idea of the God of the gaps. And I think this was sort of an overarching theme when it comes to the sciences in chapter 4. The overall idea was that sometimes we think or we hear about sort of the God of the gaps, or is God a science stopper? So just to kind of look at that for a moment. So yes, the God of the gaps, basically the idea that when the ancients were, trying to explain natural phenomena, volcanic activity, lightning, thunder, and this sort of thing, yes, it's sort of a gap filler. They would invoke God as the cause of these things. And but we've made discoveries since then. I think where that term God of the gaps and God as a science stopper, where that really comes into play today is that, unfortunately, there are people within the Christian community that give very simplistic answers, like, well, God did it. And I think when faced with important questions that we need to wrestle with, like the origin of the universe, the origin of life, some of them do they'll just say, well, God did it. And so, perhaps this is what, when people use this term God of the gaps, they have in mind. As I said, unfortunately, there are people that do that. But I don't think that just because there are some people that give those kind of answers, I don't think that we should just assume that all attempts or any attempts to bring God into the conversation in a reasonable manner, I don't think that, we can't disallow that there are good reasons to bring God into the conversation. So I think that those are some of the ways. In fact, think about it this way. When it comes to the God of the gaps, if you really think about it, the materialist really has a God of the gaps of their own, and it's called evolution. It's called evolution. And so when they explain things that we've yet to understand, they'll say, well, evolution did it. Not all of them do that. Some people do that. They'll say that evolution did it. It's just sort of a quick and simple way to respond to unanswered yet undiscovered phenomena. But I think another thing with the God of the gaps we need to keep in mind is that when we properly, not like God did it kind of arguments, but when we properly wrestle with the facts and properly and responsibly bring God into that conversation, it's important to understand we are not doing so on the absence of evidence, but we're making a positive case for God's existence.
Right.
In other words, we're not bringing God into the conversation on the basis of things that we do not understand. We're bringing God into the conversation on the basis of what we do understand. For example, I think a great example of this is the information we find in DNA. I think that is a reasonable argument. When we look at DNA, when we look at the information, I think it is worth noting that, well, in fact, let me focus on the nature of information itself, because others have done a great job of just showing this, that there is this phenomenal, incredible genetic code. But let's think about the nature of information itself for a moment. A couple of things we find about the nature of information is that, number one, it is not of a material nature. And number two, it is always the product, at least the kind of information that we're talking about, it is always the product of an intelligent cause. So let's just kind of think about that for a moment. So if we were to spill ink onto a sheet of paper, for example, somebody spills ink onto a sheet of paper, that's not going to produce a document. It's not going to produce a newspaper article. So if you think about that example, yes, natural laws can explain why the ink bonds to the paper, but natural law in and of itself is not adequate to explain the arrangement of that ink when we see a newspaper or when we see a printed document. Now you have to bring into this conversation an intelligent cause. So how does that relate to DNA? Well, in a very real way. So we look at DNA, and you have what you would call the genetic letters of the genetic code, and those letters are, they bind to, they are on the backbone, the phosphate backbone of the DNA. So you have these letters along the backbone of the DNA, or the sugar phosphate backbone. So yes, in a sense, you could say that natural laws account for why the individual letters are adhered to that phosphate backbone in the DNA. But here's the problem. Each letter in and of itself does not have a natural attraction to each other. So it doesn't explain this complex code we see in DNA. I think Stephen Meyer gives a great example I love, where he uses like one of these small magnetic boards that you often have for children, where you have a small magnetic board with magnetic alphabet letters. So in a very similar way, yes, natural laws can explain why each of those letters magnetically sticks to the board. But if we walked into a room and you see an entire paragraph, a very complex, specific paragraph spelled out with those letters, those letters are not attracted to each other. There's no unnatural attraction letter to letter. And so our most basic intuitions tells us that intelligence is at work there.
Yeah, the signs of intelligent life, really even the signs of creativity and artistry. And so I think we would say that there's positive evidence for creation that Brady doesn't seem to be taking seriously. Meanwhile, believing that there's loads of evidence for evolution across all kinds of scientific fields. Do you want to say anything about the evidence for creation that I think would be important for him to consider?
I think that what Marty brings up, the argument from information, that Stephen Meyer would be a great example recently of someone who's dealt with that, though there are other information scientists and geneticists who've brought this up before. But I think Stephen Meyer, in his latest book, just came out last year, The Return of the God Hypothesis, deals with 3 different arguments in which the evidence, I think, is showing very strongly that there's intelligent design behind life and behind the universe. And the origin of life is just one of those examples. The argument from information features prominently in that book. But also you have the origin of the universe as well as the fine-tuning of the universe. And these are areas where secular, agnostic, and even atheist astronomers, cosmologists, physicists have been saying, it looks like there's there's a supernatural cause behind the universe. Now, of course, they don't come to the same conclusions that we would, but they're saying, hey, there seems to be something here, something worth looking into, and it's certainly pointing in the direction of a supernatural cause. In fact, let's see here. Oh, yeah.
While you're finding that,
no
it's
problem.
interesting because, we're like, hey, man, take this stuff serious. I mean, at least he's read some of it because he actually footnotes Stephen Meyer's The Return of the God Hypothesis in this very chapter we're reading.
Right.
So it's like, man, you weren't impressed by none of that. That didn't do nothing for you. But Eugenie Scott did. Okay. But what you got, Ben?
Oh, yeah. So Arno Penzias, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist, he had said, in summary, this is after he finished describing the evidence, he says, in summary, therefore, astronomy leads us to a unique event, a universe which was created out of nothing, one with the very delicate balance needed to provide exactly the conditions required to permit life, and one which has underlying, one might even say, supernatural plan, an underlying supernatural plan. Thus, the observations of modern science seem to lead to the same conclusions as centuries-old creation beliefs. Centuries-old beliefs, he says, I put in there, creation beliefs is what he's referring to in the context. And he goes on to say, at the same time, most of our modern scientific intuition seems to be more comfortable with the world as described by science of yesterday.
Interesting. Well, we're talking about science. Evolution. Is it science? I know that sounds crazy. Maybe we could rephrase it and say, is it a theory? Because in here, he's saying, hey, man, Christians can't just say, hey, evolution's a theory, therefore it's false. And we would agreed with that's not really a way to go. But, do you guys think that evolution deserves the title of theory in the first place? And if so, why? Let's talk about that. Is evolution a theory?
Well, if I could share, there are several obstacles to the theory itself, but just in generally speaking, let's think about that for a moment. Is it, because I think the general idea, I think some people, if you ask most people, I think a lot of people do feel confident thinking that it is a solid theory. I think part of the problem, though, is that theory has become so flexible and so elastic that I'm not sure that there's really any way to falsify it. And that is a very important component when we're talking about theories. Now, so let me just quickly read this flexibility. And I mentioned this earlier when I said that even this has become sort of their God of the gaps with a small letter G. So listen to this quote, because I just think he does a great job of summarizing how that this theory has become so flexible, there's just really no way to falsify it. This gentleman is Matti, I'm not sure that I'm pronouncing his name correct. He's a Finnish biochemist, Matti Liasola. But here's what he says. He says, evolution is slow and gradual, except when it's fast. It is dynamic and creates huge changes over time, except when it keeps everything the same for millions of years. It explains both extreme complexity and elegant simplicity. It tells us how birds learned to fly and yet also lost that ability. Evolution makes cheetahs fast and turtles slow. Some creatures it made big and others small, some gloriously beautiful and others boringly gray. It forced fish to walk and walking animals to return to the sea. It diverges except when it converges. It produces exquisitely fine-tuned designs except when it produces junk. Evolution is random and without direction except when it moves toward a target. Life under evolution is a cruel battlefield except when it displays altruism. Evolution explains virtues and vice, love, hate, religion, and atheism. And it does all this with a growing number of ancillary hypotheses. Modern evolutionary theory is the Rube Goldberg of theoretical constructs. And what is the result of all this speculative ingenuity? Like the defunct theory of phlogiston, it explains everything while explaining nothing well.
Yeah, that's true, accurate, funny, and sad all at once.
I find it interesting that even the atheist Dr. David Berlinski, even he says that evolution really doesn't qualify as a theory because it's become so flexible and so many different postulates and so overly complex to try to explain the phenomena that it's trying to explain.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of it's almost like a grab bag. You know, it's a grab bag of ideas about origins, sans anything supernatural or outside of the box, so to speak. A lot of people in the live chat are asking us to define evolution. Define evolution. So let's define evolution.
Yeah, I think that's really important, Marty, unless you had something. I was going to just mention real quick that I think it's important to define this term because what we don't mean is that natural selection, as a phenomena that we observe in nature, that somehow is not a theory. Certainly, we owe a lot of credit to Darwin for discovering the power of natural selection. I think when we talk about adaptation, what's often called microevolution, and I know that Mr. Goodwin goes into that a little bit in his book, but just for the sake of getting to the definitions, I'll just mention that microevolution, I think we certainly do see examples where, let's say, with the finches and the Galapagos Islands, you see this diversity of beak size and shape among the population of these finches, and it was observed by these researchers who visited the islands on multiple years that the distribution of those sizes changed over time. At times, the shorter, smaller beaks were more common, and other times the larger, thicker beaks were more common. And in fact, what we've discovered recently is it actually cycled back on itself, and that pattern actually undid itself. But the point is that we certainly do see that adaptation. Where I would have a bit more of a concern would be macroevolution, we can certainly look at how Darwinists themselves define macroevolution, because I think it's important to be careful about those definitions. But just for the short version, if we're talking about entirely new structures, things like where did the wing come from, where did the avian lung come from, things like that. Now we're talking about a mechanism that can create all new structures, and I think that's where we're going to need to find evidence to support that kind of evolution.
Yeah, and like Stephen Meyer brought up in Darwin's, was it Darwin's Doubt, the big brown book, you know what I'm talking about? Or is it Darwin's Dilemma? Now I forgot which one it was. But, the big brown, it's got the alliteration. It's either Darwin's Doubt or Darwin's Dilemma. I
believe it's Darwin's Doubt.
Yeah, I think it is. He talks about, does evolution basically have the power to create new body plans? You hinted at that when you talk about wing structures and stuff. Right. And the answer, of course, is no. And you look on that kind of deep time scale, you have this thing that appears to be what's called the Cambrian explosion. No predecessors, nothing before it, and all of a sudden, all these new body types. That what appears to be this giant leap and gap. One other thing in defining evolution here This is now in the 60s, but this kind of works. It's from evolutionist Kirkut, and he defines the general theory of evolution this way. Quote, "The theory that all the living forms in the world have arisen from a single source, which itself came from an inorganic form." I mean, I think it's a great, simple definition. And also, when you look at it, you're like, really? That's what you guys believe? Mm-hmm. He continued, "The evidence which supports this is not sufficiently strong to allow us to consider it as anything more than a working hypothesis." So there he was like saying, maybe more of a hypothesis than theory. Now, what happens in real life? You guys know this. Not everyone makes this mistake, but my goodness, it's difficult to read writings that are pro-evolution or talk to somebody without spotting the fallacy of equivocation. And that's where you switch the meaning of a single word in the middle of the argument. So that definition for evolution will be given, and then the examples are just simply change over time, which no one disagrees with because it's observable. We've already mentioned some, like you brought up, what might be called Darwin's finches. We don't disagree, but does that get you big picture evolution? And so it's kind of a bait and switch where you'll see, here's what general theory of evolution is, but then you'll see these examples of just basically change over time, and you're like, well, that's not really what we're arguing about. So it's kind of a fallacy there. But does evolution give us good predictions? Does it explain observations? Does it lead to successful predictions across the panorama of science? Is that what evolution? Because a good theory will do that, right?
Right.
Well, does evolution do that for us? What do you think?
Well, I think Mr. Goodwin certainly thinks so. He says in his book, when a single theory has failed to be rejected because it explains observations and has led to successful predictions in as many diverse fields of study as evolution has, it's unlikely that any new theory will supplant or drastically change it.
So it's so successful, it's winning.
Right.
Creationism's not gonna make a comeback. It ain't happening.
That's what I think that's what he's saying. But It's interesting that in 2016, the oldest scientific society in the world, the Royal Society, hosted a meeting of biologists and other scientists actually dealing with basically discussing problems with the theory of evolution, particularly the mechanism that has been held even recently. In the recent versions of evolution, the neo-Darwinian synthesis, as it's sometimes called, but even more modern versions since then. And in 2016, this conference was saying not only does it need to be, do these mechanisms need to be revised, but the evidence just isn't there for the old mechanism. And then in 2018, again, at Cambridge University, another conference that had a similar goal. It's interesting, Daryl Falk, who's a biologist, he's a Darwinist, and he explains that many Darwinian scientists agree that the entire mechanism needs major rethinking. He said, quote, "Many evolutionary developmental biologists think that we are on the verge of a significant reorganization in our thinking about the mechanism of macroevolution." He goes on to say, "We're at the cusp of a major rethinking about the forces at work in macroevolution." Now, of course, someone might say, well, now, okay, that's that mechanism, but evolution is, we're talking about evolution, not just this mechanism. But evolution primarily is a mechanism. It's a way to explain how we got the diversity of species that we see on Earth today, all the diversity of life. So yes, it involves a story about common ancestry, but it also involves a mechanism of how you got that. And it's interesting. You might think, well, yeah, but the neo-Darwinian synthesis, that has been questioned for a long time. I'm not necessarily convinced we're talking about the latest versions of evolution, but it's interesting that many scientists have pointed out that even in the current version, so for example, Bruce Weber, who's a biochemist, he's a Darwinist, he says, quote, "The modern evolutionary synthesis, even in its current versions, can no longer serve as a general framework for evolutionary theory. The main reason is empirical, has to do with the evidence. Darwinism cannot accommodate the role of development and of genes in development in the evolutionary process." He goes on to say, "Darwinism in its current scientific incarnation has pretty much reached the end of its rope."
Well,
Can I interject something else? Because as we look at, and I appreciate Ben's question, define what you mean when you see evolution. So all of everything that's been set up to this point on that is really, really, really important. Just something else that came to mind is that I think that when, at least in my experience, I found that when you talk to most people and they say, well, I don't believe in God because I believe in evolution, what I found is that in most cases when you say, why do you believe in evolution, the answer I often get back from most people is they'll say, well, we see things change. And by that, I think it's safe to say that what most people mean is that they say, well, we observe these small changes in living things. I think, therefore, then there's tremendous leap in thinking where there's this assumption that these small changes that we observe, given enough time, and by the way, we need to come back to that, that given enough time, these small changes will add up into big changes. And before I forget to come back to that, some of the things I'm about to point out that we need to understand about the harmful nature of mutations, that selection is a removal process. Mutations, you're going to see, are harmful, even if it's in subtle ways. It's the accumulation of it. But the point is, what my friends will often say is, well, Marty, given enough time. But think about it this way. Let's say, try to imagine if, we're standing in a room and if I say, I'm going to get from here to there, and suppose, just for the sake of the discussion, say that I can only walk backwards in a straight line. If I say, if you just give me enough time, I'll get from here to there. As you can see, if I can only walk backwards in a straight line, I'm never going to get there, right? Is never going to happen. Right. You can give me a bajillion years. It's not going to happen. And that's the problem with evolution, with the theory, is that selection is a removal process. Mutations, there's an accumulating harmful buildup, genetic burden. We see in population genetics, it's really, really clear that we're heading in the wrong direction. And so just given the nature of mutations, it's like rust on a car. It is referred to as nearly neutrals, mostly nearly neutrals, but be careful with that word because it's subtle, but it's harmful. It's the cumulative, it's like rust on a car. It's really, really subtle, but the overall effect is toward decay. But the point is, given enough time...
and some, of course, are even fatal,
Yeah, right? But you're headed in the wrong direction. Yeah. So it's not a matter... So that doesn't solve anything. But the point I was going to make, in addition to that, is that no matter how much time you give it, if you're heading in the wrong direction, you're not going to get there. But the other problem, getting back to the idea that just given enough time, that small changes somehow add up into big changes, one of the problems with that is that when you're talking about genetics and biochemistry, small changes are not simple changes. So let's say we crack open your laptop. I don't mean open the lid. I mean open that bad boy up. And we just blindly reach in with pliers and pluck out one of the components on that motherboard. It's a small change. That is not a simple change because everything on that board is so integrated. So small changes are not simple changes. We've got to be really careful with that. I think the other thing we got to keep in mind is that if these small changes somehow add up over time into big changes, those are huge assumptions about all of the intermediates having an advantage, or at least most of them. But then you look at, so if you think about intermediate stages, think about things like the brilliant engineer Stuart Burgess points out that there are examples. The human knee joint is a great example of a 4-bar mechanism. There are creatures, some fish have these amazing, what they call 4-bar mechanisms. So within the human knee, you've got this beautiful example of a 4-bar mechanism in terms of the arrangement of the ligaments. And he goes into detail, but the point is, any engineer will tell you, you cannot achieve a 4-bar mechanism a little bit at a time. You either have everything or nothing. It's not possible to get that kind of an arrangement incrementally, certainly not by blind forces. If
you're tinkering with it along the way, it doesn't work, and you're just set up for failure, not survival, not success. And of course, everyone remember, evolution has no goal in mind.
Right.
You know, so I mean, you even hear evolutionists talk about, well, sometimes it regresses, and sometimes it goes because it doesn't have a place it's going, right? It could be like missteps or misfires. It's like, well, it doesn't know where it's going, but they'll often talk about it as if it does, almost if it has foresight, but it doesn't. So listen to this. Actually, in the next chapter, he says, well, creationists are going to say that. Objection 3, natural selection is insufficient as a mechanism for evolution. I want to read you guys what he said and get your reaction here, because it's kind of what we're talking about a little bit here, although that's not all we're saying here. This is page 92. The naturalist Alfred Wallace arrived at the theory of natural selection independently and around the same time as Darwin. However, Wallace disagreed that it could sufficiently explain the origin of mankind. Instead, he believed that direct divine intervention must have played a role, meaning God must have had an immediate hand in mankind's formation. Not just Wallace, but even some of Darwin's closest allies had a problem with this aspect of his hypothesis. For one, natural selection does not explain why speciation occurs in organisms existing where environmental conditions remain constant, with no observable change in the climate, ratio of male to female population, increases or decreases in predators' available food source, etc. One more paragraph, guys. Also challenging the idea of natural selection as the sole driver of evolution was the observation that in some cases, speciation seems to occur where there has not been enough time for variation to occur, to have happened, for variation to have, I'm sorry, I'm messing that sentence up. Occur where there has not been enough time for variation to have happened gradually. Rather, within a generation or two, degrees of variation could be detected. A most serious objection is the question of how an adaptation in the parent makes its way into the constitution of the offspring, which has not yet faced the circumstances that challenge the parent to adapt. Why does the offspring not revert to the species' original form? It is important to note that Darwin himself acknowledged these issues from the beginning. In The Descent of Man, he reminds his critics that, quote, even in the first edition of The Origin of Species, I distinctly stated that inherited effects of use and disuse of both to the body and mind, the direct and prolonged action of changed conditions of life, and occasional reversions of structure, among other factors, all play a role. Nonetheless, evolution as a theory was not widely embraced at first and gained acceptance only gradually. Its dominance came between the 1920s and 1950s as other corroborating evidence began to emerge. To this evidence we now turn. And so then the rest of this chapter, the chapter after the one we're covering, he then gives what he calls many convincing proofs for evolution. But I mean, it just seems like, I guess, we're being agreed with. What's your reaction to that? But because he's saying that's an objection that creationists, will bring up, like that natural selection is not a sufficient driver, and or maybe sole driver would be a better way to say it.
Right. It sounds like he's setting it up to then bring in mutation and talk about the neo-Darwinian synthesis that, natural selection by itself is not going to be enough, but you need something to explain how you get new traits. And so usually a Darwinist will then turn to mutation and say, well, this explains it. You get variation through mutation, and then natural selection filters those. But I remember
in when I took paleontology, or anthropology is what they call it. We studied paleontology there. But when I took it at MCC, actually, she kind of brought up these different things and said, well, is it this or is it that? Or is it that? And it was kind of like, well, it's all of the above. It's all of those things.
Yeah.
Saying what are the mechanisms for evolution? And the answer was, well, I think it's all of those things. It kind of is literally exactly what you just said, which is kind of a grab bag. But go ahead.
A teacher was good at rhetoric. I think that's a good way to use it. Is it A or B? It's actually both. And that sounds like very profound. I think there's some legitimacy to the fact that through history, Darwin focused mainly on natural selection and just mentioned variation, didn't know where that variation necessarily came from. And then we later discovered through genetics that it is true that there are mutations that exist. Our genes are kind of constantly bombarded with mutations. Now, some of them we have in all our cells, we have corrective mechanisms that repair a lot of those mutations, but nevertheless, some make it through. What's interesting is even the Darwinist and biologist Lynn Margulis, Dr. Margulis, still points out that mutation plus natural selection is inadequate to produce novelty. She mentions that she was taught that over and over again, that the accumulation of random mutations led to evolutionary change, of course, filtered through natural selection. She said that this led to new species. She said, I believed it until I looked for the evidence. And that was in 2011. She pointed that out. Now, she's no longer with us, but she pointed that out in 2011. And I think that's what a lot of, if you go through, by the way, you can go online and actually listen to all the sessions for the 2016 Royal Society Conference where they discussed these mechanisms. And also some of the information from the 2018 conferences are available online for free and for medium fee. You can download the rest of them. But the point is that what you'll see there is that there is certainly not agreement that mutation plus natural selection produces all these new features.
Yeah, I think a great book I'm going to recommend that I think is written at a clear lay level, yet I think has sufficient depth, is Jonathan Sarfati's The Greatest Hoax on Earth. Right. So he gets into some of what we're talking about now. It's really a response to Dawkins' book, The Greatest Show on Earth. Right. But I recommend Jonathan Sarfati, The Greatest Hoax on Earth, because some of what we're discussing now, he talks about more in depth, although we can't hit it as deep as we might want to go. In fact, we might need to wind up kind of soon here. I'd like to see if we can get some questions from the chat. So to the audience, listen, you want to ask a question to Marty Clapp, James Umber, these esteemed guests I've got here today. You can tell why I invited them here, and I appreciate them coming down to the studio, doing a little different setup, but we are all next to each other, see? Well, it's not working. Hold on.
There you go.
There we go. I'm proving it, see? And everyone has a different camera on them, and everyone also has a different kind of mic. This is what happens, when people donate stuff, you end up with mismatch, but it's all right. We got the fuzzy mic, this is the rapper mic, and this is the actual podcasting mic right here. Anyways, so listen, if you want to ask a question, put capital Q with a colon and then question mark at the end. That's the best way to do it. And we'll even maybe throw some comments on there. But let's throw some final comments out while we maybe get a couple questions here. Marty?
Well, I just saw a comment that pops up where Dinu says one of the biggest problems that evolution can't deal with or answer is the development of sexual reproduction. That is a major obstacle because it's not just human sexual reproduction. You're talking insects, birds, across the board. There's so many. So just contemplate that for a moment. You've got, not only do you have to explain by blind processes all of the obvious physical apparatus on the outside, all of the internal reproductive organs, we're talking all the way down to the cellular level. And since evolution relies on reproduction, in theory, then how's this going to happen? Yeah. How is that going to happen? It's a major problem. You got to have all the apparatus at the same time, finding each other. It's mind-boggling. So it's a major problem. In fact, even starting off with the theory, you notice that at the very first chapter, if you not of this book, but of the overall theory of evolution, the concept of evolution, you cannot invoke natural selection to get to that first cell because natural selection doesn't even enter the conversation until you have a replicating cell. But this, she brings up a really, that's a huge obstacle.
Yeah, like Sarfati talks about in the book I just recommended, he talks about how evolution attempts to explain survival of the fittest, but what about the arrival of the fittest? Yes. They got how did it get there in the first place? And that self-replication, man, that's a big thing. Twisted Titan says, the cells were producing asexually. Why would we need to produce sexually? That's interesting. Okay, so let's see. So I like that. I'm going to keep on looking for any other questions here. What about you? Final kind of words as we look to the audience. I know we missed a couple things we can't cover, but maybe we can do those another time. And I think we've hit a lot in the book. Unless you have one more thing, you're like, I got to get this out.
I'll deal with one other thing that just is really important, and I can do it, I think, fairly short. Can't give it, a detailed description, but here's let's deal with this real quick. On page 73, I believe it's page 73, Mr. Goodwin says, quote, to explain the curious case of Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2 being true yet competing accounts of creation. And then he goes on. And of course, he deals with this also in the previous chapter as well. Now, he gives a lot of details explaining how the two accounts contradict each other, Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. Given the time, I won't get into all those details, but I think it's important to point out, and maybe Mr. Goodwin has dealt with this. He certainly, I applaud him for, while he's had a successful career as an artist, went back to school and did a master's, which is no joke. Like, that's a lot of work. Went to Westminster. I mean, serious stuff. So I applaud him for that. And man, he's a hard worker, and to produce a book like this with the footnotes and everything.
It's a pretty thick book.
I give him compliments on that. And maybe he came across this, but there's a famous paper written in 1983 by an ancient Near Eastern scholar named Dr. Isaac. I'm going to mess up his name probably, Kikawada. And this is a famous paper in these discussions about Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. But what he points out is that we now have these Sumerian and Akkadian creation stories. We've had them for a while, but they've been analyzed deeper. And what we see is that just like those creation stories, Genesis 1 and 2 follow what he says, quote, the literary convention of telling the story of the origin of mankind in a doublet. The first part of the story relates the creation of mankind in a more general and abstract term, whereas the second part of the story narrates it in more specific and concrete terms, the technique of bringing the two independent parts together into a unified narrative. So all that just to say, now I don't think Dr. Kikawada is saying, he's not an errantist, he's not saying the Bible is inerrant and all that. So I'm not trying to say that he's making all those claims. What he is saying, though, is that we shouldn't interpret these as two completely separate contradictory accounts that were arbitrarily brought together, in a sort of documentary hypothesis sort of way. Instead, they were designed to work together. And we see this also in other ancient Near Eastern societies.
Yeah, so he definitely does do a lot more Genesis 1, Genesis 2 stuff in this book. BK Apologist and Chris from Detroit, they covered some of it. And that's the one review that Brady has responded to. And I know that this Sunday, they're going to drop a new live stream in which they'll offer some corrections of their position, and me might even say element, not position, but some updates, explanations of certain things they said, as well as some corrections to some things they said in their initial review, and go into more depth on some related subjects. And so check that out on BK Apologist channel, and that's good. And you can also see Brady's review on his channel, Brady Goodwin, and it's on his Facebook page. And so there's a lot of Genesis 1, Genesis 2 stuff in here, and A&E stuff. And I like that, bringing out the fact that I don't remember if he covered it. Now, I've read the book, but doesn't mean I remember every single line. I was just looking through, searching on my Kindle, because I got the physical and the digital, where Akkadian and where Sumerian appears, for example. I don't know if he dealt with that specific thing of the idea of how it's restated that way. That's interesting, because you do hear a lot of talk about the polemic element and reworking of other myths and all that, but that's interesting to bring out too, so I appreciate that.
Yeah.
So we do have some audience stuff. So guys, let's try to do them quick.
Okay.
Because this is the thing where we go
lightning round.
Oh, yeah, that's as quick as you can. Do evolutionists recognize epigenetics, and how do they put this into an evolutionary framework? It seems blatantly contradictory to me.
Right. Yeah. So just to define those terms, epigenetics would be regulatory genes, these sort of elements in our building instructions for our bodies and other organisms. In the building instructions, there are portions of the building instructions that say how to use the building instructions. So, I practiced architecture here in the Valley for 15 years. We would have our set of drawings, but then we'd have these general notes that would say how to use the drawings. Or you'd have in your spec book these sort of boilerplate sort of sections of the spec that would say, okay, if you're looking for this information, go to this section, and then combine that with this other section, that kind of thing. So that's what we see with epigenetics. We see these sections of the code that actually regulate and tell the cell how to use the code. And I can definitely see what he's saying, that it seems contradictory. I think it definitely poses a major problem, because in those elements, in those areas of the genetic code, if you make even a small change, typically it crashes the whole system. Kind of like if you go into your operating system for your computer and you start changing small areas of that, you start mutating the operating system, it's going to crash really fast.
One little thing, and that's why in 1999, all those guys are sitting around typing on keyboards trying to change the code where it didn't specify when it would turn into the year 2000. Remember that?
Right.
And they actually had that joke included in the movie Office Space.
Right,
that was what the guy had to do. He had to go fix lines of code for that very reason. Fascinating.
Now, I should mention that evolutionists certainly do wrestle with epigenetics. The question is, how well do they wrestle with it? And I think there are many geneticists who are Darwinists, who are evolutionists, who say, yes, maybe there were these mutations in the epigenetics, these sections of code that would switch on whole suites of other genes. Well, that's really interesting. But then why would evolution favor an entire suite of genes, an entire section of instructions, if they're not switched on yet?
Right. What's the survival benefit to something like that? I think some of this, now it's, everything gets updated so fast, but signature in the cell, I read all through that when I was at Talbot. I know you graduated from Talbot and went to Talbot. That was a book we read under J.P. Moreland. And, I just remember all this stuff about, and he explained it really well, but that's another book, I know we brought up Stephen Meyer a few times, but guys, read Stephen Meyer's Signature in the Cell. Really good stuff. I know we want to say more on that, but we can't. Cherokee Gypsy, if you guys can't, some of these are kind of technical. How does one account for a protein molecule and not just one? Cherokee Gypsy wants to know.
Right.
Do we have anything to say? We can skip some of these questions.
Well, I'll just say something real quick, just because last night in our discussion group at ASU, we were just talking about this. So the proteins are made up of these building blocks called amino acids. And so in order to get the first cell, you're eventually going to have to get amino acids, and you're going to have to form them into proteins. But it turns out that's an incredibly complex process. Now, there are certainly theories out there for how you might form amino acids through natural processes on the early Earth. So the idea that just chemicals came together to form these building blocks, and then those building blocks just came together to form proteins. I just encourage everyone out there, don't just say, well, okay, someone has come up with an explanation. That's good enough for me. It's explained. No, the fact of the matter is you need to look into those explanations. And Signature in the Cell, I think, does a great job of explaining, describing all those different theories and critiquing them. I think the fact of the matter is that these theories have huge holes. Like, imagine plot holes. There are huge plot holes in each of these theories. They're really grasping. And I think the evolutionary biologists, the biochemists, origin of life researchers, who actually believe that life formed through chemicals, they admit, no, we are stretching right now. We're trying to find an explanation. Now, of course, they wouldn't say design is the best explanation, but they're just saying, hey, we're ignorant of the best explanation. But I think Dr. Stephen Meyer, through his information argument and other arguments, shows that actually the best explanation would be design.
If you want a simplified version of that, Sarfati's book, The Greatest Hoax on Earth, chapter 13 does a good basics of that. And I remember I went and saw Dawkins talking to Krauss at ASU.
Right.
And they're on the stage, and Krauss is like, yeah. And they're talking about origin of life research and stuff. Mm-hmm. And Dawkins says, no, it's a problem you should take very serious. It is a big problem. And Krauss is kind of like underplaying it, like the severity of the depth of the issue. And Dawkins, I was there with Jeff Durbin.
Yeah.
So it was just me and Jeff Durbin. And I turned to Jeff and was like, dude, Dawkins is like telling him what's up right now. He's like, I know, watch this. And it was like Krauss was kind of underplaying it. Dawkins was like, no, we need to roll up our sleeves and get in there. Like he was saying that kind of thing. And Krauss is just almost like, yeah, well, And I always thought that was fascinating. I'm sure it's on video somewhere. Obviously, I'm giving my paraphrase character. But you can really see in a subtle, it's not as subtle on some of it, where Dawkins is helping Krauss to understand, no, this is a big deal.
Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead, Marty.
I was just going to, I appreciate the question from Cherokee Gypsy. Yeah, how does one account for a protein molecule? If you want to look into this further, and I would really encourage you to do so, look into the work by Douglas Axe.
Oh, yeah.
His work is unbelievable, and he's doing these...
Undeniable.
I think that's
the name of the book.
Yeah, now they have to be careful with that. It's undeniable, but they do have to be careful with the topic, because didn't somebody else write a book by that same title?
Yeah.
I don't think it was Bill Nye.
Just look up AXE. That's his last name.
AXE, Douglas Axe.
And it has like a
or his videos, his YouTube videos,
Right.
because he really nails it. The illustrations he uses, it will blow your mind. The bottom line is, it's undeniable.
Now, if I can mention real quick, I mentioned that all these origin of life researchers who hold to a naturalistic origin of life have come up with various theories. They're very weak, and I think intelligent design is the best explanation. It would be tempting to say, well, you creationists are not willing to do what Dawkins talked about. Let's roll up our sleeves. Let's get in there. You're shutting down the science and saying design explains it. Stop the research, close down the labs. That is not what we're saying at all. Just because we think design is the best explanation doesn't mean that we shouldn't do our hardest to try to find other explanations and explore those routes. We applaud the work of origin of life researchers doing amazing biochemical research. James Shapiro does fantastic work. Many origin of life researchers do great work, but actually, there's a different Shapiro. But anyway, the point is, who's an origin of life researcher. But the point is that they're doing great work. We applaud that. Keep up the good work. In fact, creationists ought to be willing to go in there and say, hey, I'm willing to question my own view, and let's see if some of these other mechanisms work and set aside my bias. But currently, with the evidence we have, the conclusion that I think is best is intelligent design.
Excellent. Ben wants to know, what can we do to avoid falling into and spreading the mindset that God and science are mutually exclusive? And I know we dealt with that a little bit in the beginning, but let's talk about it as we wrap up here, getting questions from the audience.
Right.
How do we fix that, man?
Well, I think, as we looked at this part of the history of science, we said that they laid the foundation for science, and then we talked earlier about, I'm just looking at his question there, they're not mutually exclusive. So maybe if everybody just goes back to the earlier part of this podcast, I think that they'll see that that they're not. It's going to become clear they're not mutually exclusive. That even the unbeliever takes a lot of things, foundational things, for them that are foundational. They take by faith, and so they have their own version, their own faith, and the sciences and I'll say it again, that to even get off the ground with sciences, you've got to work within the laws of logic. You've got to work with a predictable universe, which, apart from God, good luck.
On a practical level, I'll say some things I try to do, like within my kids, for example. So I subscribe to the Creation magazine by CMI. I subscribe to Answers in Genesis, Answers. I even subscribe to the Creation Research Science.
Acts and Facts.
ICR. I subscribe to Acts and Facts.
Okay,
but also the Quarterly.
Oh, the Quarterly, yeah.
Yeah,
Creation
the
Research
more
Society
one,
Quarterly.
as well as one put out by some folks in Alabama, Discovery. That's like a 4-page thing that's made for kids. And then I also drag the kids out to AZOSA meetings, which is the Arizona Origin Science Association meetings, and they don't necessarily really always want to go. And there'll be some guy at the front talking about work he did for a chemical company in Columbus, Ohio, and now he does this in Prescott, and et cetera, et cetera. I'm thinking about one of the last meetings we went to there at ACU, and I know some of this is just for Phoenix people, what I'm saying, but part of what I do is, because he's like, oh, we're doing that, and but I say, well, here's why we're doing this, and then I'll buy some books. They sell books afterwards, and I usually try to get the books that are written for teens. The reason is even if sometimes I know, unless I read it to him, that's not a book he'll grab one of his novels or something. Part of the reason is to show we're not anti-science. Look on the cover here of this magazine, and it's about animals. And look at here, the guy is talking tonight about DNA, and the guy in the last talk, he's talking about deposition of sedimentary layers. And you see, just showing an appreciation for that, an understanding for that, a care for that, a concern for that. And then we subscribe to the Answers TV, their streaming platform they have, which is pretty cool. And I know that all that stuff is not necessarily the first option. that to say, hey, let's open this up, right? But part of it is to show a love and appreciation for science. I just bring that up maybe as a practical level, like guys in your own family think, how can you encourage your kids and family to see, okay, we care and appreciate science. Now, I'm sure there might be an evolutionist, naturalist, whatever you want to say in the audience saying, well, none of that's really science. So you're just showing him that you're an idiot and that you're into pseudoscience. Might as well, subscribe to the Flat Earth Society newsletter, right? And I can see someone saying that, but understand what we're saying is that no, God made this and it's to be enjoyed and also explored. And sometimes I'll talk to him about a career in science, especially when he doesn't want to do his math. Now, I'm not going to, I don't want to do a career in science. Well, you say that now, but here's why you might want to do a career in science. Right. So just practical ways, guys, think about that. And then supporting those organizations. That's the other thing is it supports those organizations. So to me, that's part of the answer. How do we show that? There's practical ways. Yes, we can talk about it and do this and that, but there's some practical things.
Is there still time for a quick comment on that?
Yeah.
So looking at Ben's question, I think definitions are really, really important because I don't know about you guys. I find that many, many times, especially when it comes to what we would call historical science, which deals with past events that are unique that we don't have access to, that type of science. What I find is that when most of my unbelieving friends say that they believe in science, quite honestly, many of them, what they mean by that is something known as methodological naturalism. And by that, it's just a 8 or 9 whatever syllable word, which means that that one who takes that approach to science is saying that the explanations that we give in our research, it has to have a natural explanation. It has to have a material explanation, and we're not going to allow anything outside of that. Now, I think that's a huge problem because that's in conflict with the fact that all of us know by experience that sometimes some things are caused by intelligent causes. That not everything has and so let's just take that approach. I mean, if we took all sciences with that approach of methodological naturalism by saying we only allow natural causes as an explanation, what if they took that approach when they ran across the Rosetta Stone?
Right.
What if you taught a CSI class? What if someone, I don't, this is not a great comparison, but what if somebody took that kind of starting point with criminal investigation and stood up in front of their class and said, so ladies and gentlemen, when you come upon a crime scene, always keep in mind, number one rule is that you are never allowed to consider a suspect over 6 feet tall. That's just our starting rule. Well, if you're going to start off with a rule like that, you may miss the truth.
Yeah, I like how Meyer actually flips some of that on its head. So he talks about an idea of a neo-Darwinism, or perhaps even basically stated by Darwin himself as well, is that whatever we see now must be explained by processes that are currently operable, currently at work.
Right.
And so it's explaining things sort of within the box, so to speak. And he says, okay, let's take that. Whatever we see here must be able to be explained by something here, right? So it's also, you might say, well, that's ruling out supernaturalism, but hold on, let's look at this for a second. And then Meyer says, that's exactly what we're doing when we point to intelligent design. We're saying this specified information, this specified complexity, this language, this coding, and then he gives great detail, great examples, that only is produced, the only causal agent that, for example, assigns meaning to basically what are letters, because it's like
right.
arbitrary. Why does that have this value? Why that value, not some? It's arbitrary.
Yeah.
The only cause for that, and he lists a bunch, okay? And I'm not doing it justice. I mean, it's a thick old book. He talked about signature in the cell. He
Right.
says the only cause is an intelligent agent every time. So if we're going to take that, let's take that.
Yeah.
Then when you look at it, it has to be an intelligent agent. It has to be an intelligent agent. And that's why sometimes you will see evolutionists, when they're going way back here, will say, well, we could have been seeded. The germ for life, in essence, could be seeded from another place, from some other beings. It could be seeded here, essentially, and then we're kind of growing from that.
Right.
It's sort of extraterrestrial intelligent design at that point.
Yeah.
But they would look at it as, well, those guys would have been the product for evolution too. So then you really get into infinite regress, right? So who seeded them, and on and on and on. I think we got to end there, guys. Final words, especially, brother, how do people support you? How do people find you?
Yeah.
Because this guy is out on the college campuses, Ratio Christi. I mean, it's crazy. I don't always remember to do it, but I got your whole schedule. If you look at my calendar,
Awesome.
if you look at my calendar, I have your calendar every day. It repeats, because ideas I'm supposed to pray for you on all those days. So see, I got it. I'm not there.
Very cool.
But I have it on there because I'm supposed to either join you or pray for you all these days, because he's out on the campuses, and he does it in a winsome and very practical, but also filled with great information way. And that's why we love having James at Bless the Block. How do people support you and find you, man?
Yeah. So you can, for the work that I'm doing on the campus full time there, James Umber at ratiochristi.com. Or ratiochristi.org, I think, actually. ratiochristi.org. So you can check it out. You can always email me, and I can send you all the information about what we're doing out there and how you can support that. Also, Marty and I have put together some resources, some videos at examined-life.org. So living the examined life. So examined-life.org.
Excellent. Marty, what about you? People, maybe they live in Phoenix, could even, if they got kids, they could go to your Sunday school class. I don't know. What's a way to practically get a hold with you or support some of what you're doing, Marty?
Well, I am still out there working with the youth at Compass Christian Church in Chandler, and so we would love to have your young people come visit us. It would be great to meet them. And as we just look at this topic, I think, there's so many topics that people talk about these days, but as we just take a moment to just stand back and look at the big picture, we have to admit, now, wherever somebody's coming from on this topic of origins and how we got here and why we're here, and these are, I think even those who differ with us on some of the things we said today, these are important questions. These are the big questions. These are the ultimate questions, aren't they? They really, really are. And so I appreciate that people are willing to, and I just encourage everybody to keep your mind open to some of the things that we said today. Even if you do not necessarily agree with us, check it out. Be willing to hear us out. Keep an open mind on that.
No doubt. And if you do live in the Arizona area, man, hit me up. I got some good regular events that I go to that I'm a part of where you can learn more about this kind of stuff. Well, by God's grace, coming up here within an hour, I'm going to be responding with some other guests, not with me in the studio, but online, to another chapter, specifically chapter 1 of this book. So I'm hoping it works out, because that'll be 2 live streams in a day, back to back. This is the double header live stream. And I hope that when I do the next one, you people give more super chats, because I want you to support them, but also support this channel, subscribing, hitting that bell, leaving comments, sharing, all that kind of stuff, taking clips and putting on other social media, praying, super chat, Patreon, all that information on top of the screen. So with that, I think we're going to jam out. Guys, it's been great to be with you. Peace out. God bless. And